As we've been looking through Genesis, the first book of the Bible, we've been exploring this first family, Abraham and Sarah. Why would God call these not just imperfect, but really bad choices? Because they're not able to have children. They're way too old. They don't live in the right spot to go to a certain place in their old age and to become the mother and father of all of us, of a great many nations. And we've looked at their lives and how they messed up so many times, even after they were called, even after the promise of blessing was reaffirmed in their lives. And then we looked at Isaac, their son's son, Jacob, and how last week we learned he wasn't the firstborn son, but somehow tricked his brother Esau into gaining the blessing, and there was lentil stew involved. And now we get to Jacob's sons, and one of them, the 11th of his sons, is named Joseph. And Joseph is 17 years old, and he has these dreams. They're pretty crazy. In one of them, all his brothers are sheaves of wheat bowing down to him. In another one, they're stars, and they're all bowing down to him. He also has a nice coat. You might have heard of the Technicolor Dream Coat. We're not sure if it was Technicolor or not, but it did have long sleeves, and it probably had a couple of colors in it. But this made his other brothers jealous. This is kind of where we pick up in the story, Genesis 37, verse 19. His brothers said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben's the oldest of the brothers, when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of the hand, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So when Joseph came to his brother, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore. And then they took him and threw him into the pit. The pit was empty and there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. This is the word of God for the people of God. I've only had an experience of my home being broken into one time. It wasn't here in Perdido. It wasn't at my last appointment. It was in my first appointment. I was right out of seminary. I was single, and I bought a really cheap home that was built in 1924. And it was a perfect little starter home. It was a shotgun house. It had a door at the front and a long hallway and a door at the end, and there were rooms off of the hallway on both sides. And so one morning, I'd gone to church, I had gone to lunch, I had done some activities in my office or whatnot back at the church. I came home, I got out of the car, I went up to the front door, and I unlocked it, I opened it, I took one step in, and I could see that the back door had been shoved in, busted open. And so I then ran to my car, locked it, and called 911. And I said, "I think I've been broken into." I explained what had happened. What am I supposed to do? They said, "Well, you can stay there in your car. If you'd feel more comfortable driving somewhere, that's fine, but come back in a few minutes to receive the officers. And if you are there, they'll take your key. They won't have to break in the door," all this kind of stuff. And I said, "Oh, the door's wide open. They can go right in." And so anyway, I stayed there. The officers came up. I rolled down my window. I explained briefly what had happened to them, and then they showed me their great bravery, just like officers do all the time. They walked into this house unsuspecting, not knowing what to expect at all, and the next thing I know, I hear this scream. And I think, oh my goodness, what is happening in my house? And then the next thing I know, this officer, not the one who had screamed, obviously, but the other one, comes kind of tumbling out of my house, laughing at the top of his lungs, carrying a big rubber snake. You see, what had happened was earlier that morning, I had my sister, who was just out of college, staying the weekend with me, and I'll go really early in Sunday mornings to church, and so I thought what I would do to greet my sister, since she came to stay with me over the weekend, is put a rubber snake out in the hallway so that when she left the bedroom to walk to the bathroom first thing in the morning, she'd see it and be scared out of her mind. You know, just a little bit of sibling prank, and so she did. She was so scared, she left the snake right there on the floor. She was not going to touch it. She wasn't going to kick it or move it or anything. And so we went to church. I went to church. She came to church. We had lunch together. I did some work. I came back home. The police report on 1214 Woodward Avenue, if you ever want to look it up, is going to say nothing was stolen from my house, which is true. They didn't touch a thing. And here's what the officers suspect happened. A burglar busted in the back door, saw a snake, and ran for the hills. Sibling shenanigans can help your home be saved from a robbery. You may have a home security system. We have rubber snakes at my house. But these sibling pranks can also turn into sibling rivalries. I don't have a great story about one of those. Fortunately, me and my sisters, we never really had a big sibling rivalry. Hopefully we never will, but I have in my ministry seen some crazy big ones. And some, and lots usually actually, start over something pretty small. And a lot of times I see these when a loved one has passed away, especially a parent. It's amazing at how siblings will go at one another. But this is really something. This that we just read, God's first family. I mean, they put a lot of sibling rivalry to shame. I mean, here's this boy, he's just 17. He's had a couple of wild dreams. He's wearing a coat nicer than the others. And they plot to kill him. They throw him down in a pit. And I'm sure when Joseph saw that rope come down in the pit and he started to be pulled out of that darkness and his eyes met the afternoon sun, he was thinking, I am finally saved from this horror. But instead, he sees these men in strange clothes, foreigners, exchanging money with his own brothers because they're selling him to Midianites. This boy who had dreamed that they would be kneeling down to him is now being forced to kneel on the ground, handcuffed, and sold into slavery. This is the family of God. This. I mean, isn't that unbelievable? That this crazy family is the one that God would send his holy word and his blessing through. I mean, Joseph is the 11th son. The 4th son, one of the perpetrators of this crime, his name's Judah. Do you know he's the ancestor of King David, the ancestor of Jesus? Judah is one of the ones throwing his brother in a pit and selling him into slavery. Levi was there too, by the way. He's the 3rd son of Jacob. They are no good. They're messed up. This is a really vindictive, hateful, messed up family. And yet, it was the one that God chose. I mean, you think your family's messed up. Just read Genesis again. Joseph, he has one of these lives that kind of changes quickly. You know, he's the golden boy, and suddenly he's put into chains, and he's sold into slavery. And we can relate a little bit. I mean, hasn't life ever snuck up on you like that? Where you thought it was going this way, and suddenly it was going that way? You thought parenting was going to be like this, but it's really like that. Or you thought you were going to love that job, but you really don't like that job. Or you thought marriage was going to be all happiness and roses and perfect, and it just seems sometimes impossible. Or you thought you were going to always feel fulfilled, and somehow more days seem unfulfilled. Or you thought your mother would somehow be around forever, and now you're losing her. Whatever it may be, Joseph thought his life was just going to keep getting sweeter. And now suddenly he's being sold into slavery. But Joseph's real important for some reason. I mean, he has the last 14 chapters of the book of Genesis are devoted to the life of Joseph. I mean, that rivals the Gospels in length and in story. And he is the great-great-grandson, nope, he is the great-grandson of Abraham, the father. He's central to our faith story. And there has to be some reason that this long saga is in the Bible. And anytime you have a 14-chapter saga, things are going to get a lot worse before they get any better. And that's exactly what happens to Joseph. He's trafficked into Egypt. It was one of the powerful countries, if not the most powerful country in his day. And he was sold to a man named Potiphar. And Potiphar was important in the household of Pharaoh, who was the king of Egypt. Potiphar was in charge of his royal army. Potiphar sees something in Joseph. He finds favor in him. The scriptures say that Potiphar saw the Lord in Joseph and that the Lord was working for Joseph's success. So just like Joseph's own dad, Jacob, had found favor in him, now his master finds favor in him, and he puts him as his chief attendant in charge of his whole household. And then Potiphar's wife sees something in Joseph. Potiphar's wife also finds him favorable. And she invites him to come lie down in her bed with her, and he refuses. Joseph knows that this would be an act of betrayal against Potiphar, and he doesn't want to do anything like that. And she keeps insisting, and he keeps rejecting her. And finally, she grabs his cloak. These coats keep getting him in trouble, and pulls it off, and he again rejects her. And feeling that dejection, she goes to Potiphar with Joseph's coat and says, "Look, your chief attendant tried to come and lie down with me." And so Potiphar immediately has him thrown into prison with no trial. And when he gets there, guess what happens? The prison warden finds favor in Joseph and makes Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners. And some of these prisoners, too, to be precise, have these dreams that God helps Joseph interpret. And these dreams, and in their interpretation, win these guys their freedom. And so Joseph pleads with them, "Do not forget me when you get out of prison. Tell people about me." And of course, they forget him. You see, Joseph has this life that is crazy. I mean, you've probably known people like this who have all these seeming ups, and then sometimes they just have these really low downs. He's always finding favor and rising to the top, and then thrown into pits. He is thrown into some crazy pits. Pits of jealousy, pits of lust, pits of selfishness. And we hear Joseph's story and we think, why is this in the Bible? I mean, what is this about? In the first book of the Bible, God intends for us to read this 14-chapter saga of this crazy up and down life, full of highs and lows, filled with pits. But there is a purpose for it, like all of God's holy word, to help us interpret God at work in our crazy lives, in our ups and downs, in all that we will experience. I mean, we have, this is a crazy life, but we have crazy lives. I mean, don't you? This is full of drama, but isn't your life sometimes pretty dramatic? I mean, if you think about it, it may not seem to be the same drama as Joseph's life, but it's been filled with pits, with highs, with people messing you up and you messing yourself up. Joseph experiences a lot of betrayal in his life. He is betrayed by Potiphar's wife when she makes this false accusation against him. He's betrayed by his fellow prisoners that he helps get out of prison. He's, of course, the biggest betrayal, he's betrayed by his brothers when they sell him into slavery. And we know betrayals, big and small. I think sometimes when we're betrayed, we wonder, what did I do? Am I the reason I was betrayed? Am I the cause of this pain and hurt? Or am I just unlucky? Am I the one that gets betrayed just because I'm me? When betrayal hits, it really shakes us up, especially when it hits from someone that we love. And we wonder, how could this have happened? Joseph also experienced a lot of bondage. He was bound up by his brothers. He was bound up by the slave traders. He was bound up and put in prison. And maybe your bondage hasn't been exactly like that, but we all know what it feels like to be weighted down. to be enchained by our own sins, by the sins of others. We know what it's like to be weighted down with darkness, or maybe it's depression or a wound that just won't heal. We know what it feels like to be a slave to sin and to the sin of others. And so we see this story and this bondage imposed upon him, and we wonder to ourselves about the things that have weighed us down in life. And it's not just betrayal and bondage. He also is blindsided several times. I mean, it comes out of nowhere. For him, his brother's throwing him into a pit, Potiphar accusing him of sleeping with his wife. I mean, this just seems to blindside him out of nowhere. And we also have experienced these blindsides in our lives. And it makes us defensive. And it makes us very insecure. It makes us a group of anxious people wondering, when is the next bad thing going to happen? When is that next unexpected phone call or bad news or surprise death going to hit in our lives? And I'm not trying to highlight the fact that we've all been betrayed and all been bound and all been blindsided to tell you that you have a rough life. I'm just trying to be honest because it's church, and this is where we need to be honest. Life is rough. And we have and we will all experience these pains and these brokennesses. He's also been abandoned. I wanted it to start with a B. I couldn't think of a word. I don't know. Where I'm from in the South, abandoned kind of is pronounced bandoned, so you could just go with that, I guess. Never going to make it in this business. But anyway, Joseph is down in the bottom of a pit. He's been totally forgotten. He feels all alone. I mean, how many times in his life does he feel, because of his betrayal and because of his bondage and because of his blindsidedness, how many times he feels totally abandoned? And I know you've been there before. Like you have to do it all on your own. You're left to your own devices to figure it out. You might have even said, God has completely forgotten you. Or why would God even remember me? Maybe you've even felt totally abandoned by Jesus Christ, that no one really cares about your success, about your healing, about your being pulled up and set free. Jesus had a life that looked a lot like this first family of God's, full of betrayal and bondage, a sense of abandonment. When you feel these things, turn to Genesis. Look at the people whom God called. Look at his first family. Remember that these are parts of your life, but do not confuse the way that people treat you with the way that God treats you. There's enough of that already, because that's what could happen. We could know that we've been betrayed and abandoned and bound up and blindsided. That doesn't mean God did it. And don't ever confuse the way you feel about yourself and the way you treat yourself with the way that God treats you or feels about you. God will not ever abandon you. God has never forgotten you. God was always with Joseph, never left Joseph on his own, was always there. In fact, a theme of Joseph's life is that people kept forgetting him, but God never forgot him. Joseph was sold into slavery, and the Lord was with him in slavery. Joseph was sent down into Egypt, and the Lord was with him even in Egypt. Joseph went into prison, and God was with him in that prison. God was there, never abandoning him, never letting him be on his own. God was always with him. And you know what else Joseph did? As he journeyed through all this brokenness and all these bad circumstances, he would feel hurt and pain and anger and frustration just like the rest of us, but he always tried to do what was right. He never abandoned God in the midst of those bad circumstances. He believed the Lord was with him. He let the Lord continue to use him. He made the better decisions. And 2 years later, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, has one of these prison buddies of Joseph's. And Pharaoh has this dream, and he can't figure out what it means, and all these people are trying to help him interpret it. And one of these prisoners says, that's now in Pharaoh's household, says, hey, I know this Hebrew. He's in jail. You may want to call him up and see if he can interpret the dream for you. And so Pharaoh calls Joseph out of prison and into his household. And he interprets the dream because God gives Joseph the ability to do it. And through a series of interpretations and happenings, Joseph is able to save Egypt from an incoming famine. And what the Pharaoh does is the Pharaoh promotes him and puts him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. The scriptures say the Pharaoh took off his signet ring and put it on Joseph's finger from Pharaoh's own finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen. He put a gold chain on his neck, and he had him ride in a chariot as his second in command. I mean, think about that. This boy from another land, another nation, sold into slavery, is now in the chariot with the Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the known world. He's standing there in his chariot, second in command of all of Egypt, this great nation. He's really wearing a nice coat now, I can promise you that. And in this new position of honor and power, Joseph saves the whole known world from a famine. He saves the king. He saves the prison warden and his prison buddies. He saves Potiphar and Potiphar's wife. And he even saves those awful brothers of his. Because they're back in their land of Canaan. And Jacob, their dad, who's now called Israel, realizes, hey, we're dying from starvation. Y'all go down and see what's happening in Egypt. They didn't use y'all, but you know what I'm saying. And so the boys get together and they go down into Egypt. And they go into Joseph's household and they walk up to Joseph. They don't know that he is their brother. And they all beg for food and some kind of relief from this famine. And Joseph sees and recognizes that they are his brothers. But he knows that they don't know it yet. And he has to go off to a room by himself and cry because he's so emotional by the fact that God has brought them all back together again. And then there's a whole series of events that we can't quite get into, but you can read them in Genesis. We got to get to communion soon. But basically what happens is all the boys are there, even Benjamin, now the youngest. And Joseph finally says, everybody out of my house. And they all go out except the brothers. And Joseph comes down and he first hugs Benjamin and he weeps over his shoulder. And the crying is so loud that the Egyptians heard it. Even Pharaoh's household heard it. And they all come together in this reuniting and this emotional time. Jacob, his dad, comes down and sees his son. They live together for 17 years there. And then Jacob dies. And the boys think, you know what? If I was Joseph, I might bring about my reckoning now. Come after us for some revenge. So they go back to him and they lay down before him and they say, please forgive us. Don't remember what we did to you way back then. And Joseph gives us a line that we could ponder for the rest of our lives. He really does. He gives, I think, kind of like a theme verse, if you will, for Genesis, maybe for the sermon series, maybe for it all. This is Genesis 50, verse 20. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. You see, in the midst of all this mess, of all this hurt, of all these tears, Joseph was able to view all that pain in the context of what God is and would do through him and his brothers. Joseph was able to see that God would take everything in his life and use it as an opportunity to do good and for the saving of many lives and of many people. It's these two words. The whole thing hinges on these words, but God. Joseph was sold into slavery, but God was with him in his bondage. Joseph was sent down into Egypt, but God was with him the whole time. Joseph was put in prison, but God was there working in him. Joseph had all this betrayal. He was blindsided. He was bound up. He was abandoned, but God was with him. Friends, when you have been the perpetrator of betrayal, when you are the one doing the binding, when you are the one and you know you have abandoned people, or you have blindsided folks, you have harmed and you have caused brokenness, but God is a God of forgiveness. And God can take you and redeem you. And when you have experienced all that brokenness and harm in your own life, and you think you could not possibly be worthy or useful, but God can do good in your life. God can use you not just to save your own soul, but for the saving of many people. That's who God is. A God that can take us, a bunch of imperfect, messy people, and change us into the big, beautiful family of God. To do good in the world. To save many people with his goodness. You may feel betrayal. You may at times feel bound up by your own making or by the sin of others. You may feel blindsided and you may even feel abandoned. But God is with you, redeeming you, calling you to his table, sending you out to save many people. Because he is the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God of Joseph, the God of David, the God of you. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.